All right. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD Alderman Raymond Lopez of the 15th Ward. How are you today, Alderman? And Happy New Year.
I am well. Happy New Year to you and to all the WZRD listeners.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, first of all, Alderman, tell us what neighborhoods the 15th Ward encompasses.
So the 15th Ward is on the southwest side of the city of Chicago. It represents communities such as Chicago Lawn, Gage Park, Brighton Park, Back of the Yards, West Englewood, and Canaryville. I've been alderman here since 2015, celebrating now 10 years as alderman here in the city of Chicago.
Well, congratulations. What are
Thank you.
you're welcome. What are the biggest challenges of overseeing the 15th Ward?
Well, the ward as it's drawn now is one of the most gerrymandered wards in the city of Chicago. It goes in five different directions and touches several different communities. And I think the challenge for not only myself, but aldermen who represent wards in similar situations is how do you connect people and to show them that they are all interconnected when they have a hard time seeing it on a map or in a neighborhood. I have residents who are literally miles apart from each other, figuratively and literally. But it's my job to bring them together as one giant family and to show them that by focusing on what we are all concerned about is how we can move forward as opposed to focusing on how we're different.
And when it's gerrymandered like that, who does it benefit the most? It being that kind of a map.
Well, it doesn't benefit the residents, that's for sure, because it makes it all the more difficult in any one of those communities that I referenced to kind of have a sense of cohesion. And when I was first elected, it was the first time in 2015 that the back of the yards, which previously had seven different aldermen representing it, basically was under one roof in the 15th ward. Uh, Englewood, Greater Englewood, currently has six different aldermen representing it. So if you think about your community or your listeners' communities of, I want to do something or I want to bring a store or I want to bring a new business, how do you get cohesive planning when you have to go through six different individuals with six different mindsets and six different visions? It's very difficult. Um, and that's before we get to the delivery of city services. Because how do you plan for garbage pickup? How do you plan for street sweeping? How do you plan for tree trimming that is consistent for the entire community when you have six or seven individuals who have different mindsets and different priorities for delivery of city service? That's why this last remap, I was one of the supporters of having an independent process because I believe that you should not be trying to build maps based on protecting incumbents, but on protecting communities and community cohesion as the law stipulates.
Do you have an idea about what you would want the map to be?
Well, I believe that all from the entire city of Chicago, you should start at one corner, count out however many residents there are, and just make tight box-like wards all across the city of Chicago. I know there's some challenges with that, with the Voting Rights Act and things of that nature, because they're trying to ensure that individuals have the ability to elect other individuals who look like them or come from the same community. But I think that that's something that we have to reevaluate in the city of Chicago, whether or not the segregated nature of redistricting is something that is of value anymore. Currently, you have wards like the 28th ward, which literally goes from Greektown to Austin. It is, 10 miles wide and 5 blocks deep. And there's no way that you can make cohesive decisions in a ward like that.
So they're trying to unsegregate the areas with a map like that. But in your estimation, is it successful?
No, it actually has the exact opposite effect. And I will say this too, that there's something to be said for having an alderman or alderwoman who has to represent more than just their own ethnic background or their own mindset. That makes you a better, more open-minded and broader thinking individual. Whereas if you only take care of your own, you're going to have a very narrow world view. And I think that's part of what has made me so successful is that I don't have a singular ethnic constituency that I have to appease. I have to appease multiple people, whether they're Latino, they're Asian, they're white, they're African American. I can't preference one over the other, which means I have to preference them all and elevate everybody. And I think that would be a huge benefit and a wildly different city council if we ever had that in the city of Chicago.
In the legislation that you support, such as the ozempic ordinance, is that how you gauge how it could bring cohesion to your ward?
Well, a lot of the legislation that I do is not necessarily ward specific. It's more geared towards the entire city of Chicago. So, for example, we have seen where individuals are using these Ozempic knockoff type medications without prescriptions, without support, in an effort to lose weight. And I think that's something that crosses all ethnic and demographic boundaries throughout the city of Chicago. And even just recently, the Attorney General of Illinois, Kwame Raoul, came out and stated that there are dangers to the use without a doctor's supervision. So that is something that I'm trying to be proactive with addressing by banning non-prescription use of some of these generic knockoff type products. But additionally, there are things that we can do that are pretty much universal. Like when we talk about public safety, like last week I had mentioned following the horrific attack on New Orleans, that all of our community and neighborhood fairs, festivals, and farmers markets should have vehicle arresting barriers in place to keep those markets safe from people driving through, as we've saw in New Orleans, as we've seen in Germany, as we've seen in France. We do not want to be next. And that's not something that's local just to my ward, but something that I think impacts all of our communities. Additionally, when I think back to conversations about gunshot detection technology, that is something, again, that is nearly universally wanted in the city of Chicago. I believe 74% of Chicagoans support the application of that technology. My ward had it. My ward wanted to keep it. But many in Chicago wanted to ensure that we were moving forward to keep all of our citizens safe, which is why it was so important to lead that effort to try and make that a reality.
What is replacing the shot spider now? Anything?
So the mayor has put out a request for proposals to see what can replace it. But as of right now, there's nothing functioning that replaces it. So to put it another way, the mayor sold his house without having a place to move in. And we're really operating in the dark when it comes to public safety. Additionally, aside from not having the technology, the mayor and the police department and OEMC really were caught flat-footed in not having even an educational campaign to get people back accustomed to calling 911 again, because so many people have just come to rely on the technology to make those calls to make that awareness for CPD and don't realize that there's nothing listening anymore. So there was a double whammy, if you will, on Chicago neighborhoods.
Is there any anyone in any department that is tracking how removing shot spider is affecting the neighborhoods public safety wise, so that the Committee on Public Safety could study those details and then see what solutions there might be to in place of shot spider?
So sadly, I believe the answer is no, that since the technology has gone dark, there's nothing to track. We have seen where independent reporting, like CWB Chicago, for example, has been tracking how many homicides have taken place in former police districts that had gunshot detection technology. But as far as who in government is officially doing that, I would say the answer is no one.
And for public safety, oftentimes it seems as if when someone is shot or even killed, it's not always tracked. right? There are some victims that fall through the cracks and are not part of the homicide numbers. Does that happen? Because we there were cases where we heard that someone was shot. We tried so hard to find what happened, and we're not able to find it anywhere.
Yes, sadly, manipulating the data and manipulating circumstances is something that we have seen in the city of Chicago. It is something that I know has existed through all three of the mayors that I've worked with, Johnson, Lightfoot, and Emanuel. It's nothing new to try to manipulate data to get the best possible outcome for the department. For example, the city of Chicago will say that there were under 600 murders this year, but that number actually gets higher if you were to include the numbers of homicides on the expressways within Chicago. But the city of Chicago does not count them because they consider those state roads. Even though they fall within the jurisdiction of the city, they are state highways, so the city will not include them in their numbers, which I think is just one of those manipulative tactics used to artificially decrease the number of homicides in the city.
Yeah, the reason I asked was that we know of neighbors that knew that somebody was shot, and we delved into trying to find what happened, and there's nothing. It just
Well,
disappeared.
well, and we've seen not just with shootings, but with carjackings and other things where everything is labeled differently. Like, for example, if you're carjacked with a weapon, there's probably three different classifications that can be used on how to describe that scenario, whether it's armed vehicular theft, armed theft, vehicular, the list just is endless. And unless you know how to peruse through all of these variations of the same incident, it's going to make it next to impossible for a journalist or even an average citizen to figure out the truth of those numbers.
And for those homicides that you mentioned happen on the state roads, are those numbers covered in the state statistics? Do you know? Because you're in the city. I don't know if you know about that.
So I believe that the Illinois State Police has the numbers on those.
Mhm.
But again, that goes to the difficulty in which it is accessing information. If something happens in the city of Chicago's boundaries, whether it's on a highway, county road, or what have you, it's still within the city of Chicago, and you're arguing semantics to try to avoid responsibility for what's happening in the city of Chicago. Most citizens are not going to know that they have to cross-reference three or four different data sets to figure out what exactly is going on in their city. They shouldn't have to, but that's where we find ourselves today.
Let's talk about the migrant situation. Are there supposed to be six shelters in the city that house both migrants and the homeless? That's what I thought I heard, but then when I tried looking up what those what those shelters are, where they are, I can't find them.
Yeah, all of these shelters. So since the mayor declared that the migrant mission has come to an end, most of that information is no longer available to the public. And in fact, the former migrant shelters, like the notorious 2,500 person uh, shelter in Pilsen on 23rd and Halsted, that is now being transformed into a quote unquote homeless shelter. But your listeners should be reminded that the mayor himself said that while the migrant mission is over, all the migrants will now be treated as just being homeless. So they are now technically considered by this administration to be a part of the homeless problem in the city of Chicago and are going to be helped and supported in that manner. Sadly, what that means for Chicago's original homeless, those individuals who were residents here already and homeless, is that they are going to find it harder and harder to find warm beds and services because many of those 52,000 migrant asylum seekers that are here are now also going to be eligible for the same services, which we barely could help the 6,000 who were the indigenous local homelessness before their arrival.
Two questions. First of all, why doesn't the city classify the homeless people as uh, who has been homeless for how long? Like whoever has been homeless for the longest, try to help them uh, first. Uh, has the city ever done that?
So they were doing something similar with the migrants, but as far as the homeless go, I don't believe that was the case. Now, the problem will also be that you can matriculate out of the system, but they've set it up where if you are a migrant, all you have to do is get back in line to help get all the support all over again. So, for example, when you had housing and rental assistance being provided, they would get 6 months of service. And then if they chose not to go into a new housing or more stable housing or provide housing for themselves independently, then they would just get back in and start the program all over again. But
But
what
that
we have seen is that there are roughly 7,000 Chicagoans, which is why I've started using the term indigenous homeless, that they were our homelessness before. And even now, many of those individuals have been pushed aside, which is why you see these homeless encampments at Gompers Park and other locations throughout the city of Chicago, because there simply aren't enough beds available in this system. And when the mayor says that his one system, one solution mission will be enough to deal with both the migrants and our indigenous homelessness, he's really being very disingenuous in the fact that simply stating that you're going to add 2,800 beds to our homeless operation um, is not true because you're simply allowing 2,800 migrants to stay put and just watering down the funding that you have specifically for homeless that we've gotten from HUD and other uh, funding sources, and now watering it down to include both homeless as well as migrants.
when those homeless migrants, when they get back into line, do they have to let go of the housing that they're already living in and start all over and go to new quarters, or are they able to do some paperwork and continue where they have been living?
So if they are staying in shelters, they rotate through the shelter system. So as you said, there's 6 shelters. They can, in theory, go to this shelter, then this one, 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 and then start back all over again.
But the indigenous homeless cannot do that.
No.
What who stands to benefit by having the migrants get more services than the indigenous homeless?
Well, what we know will happen is that under the new system that the mayor has put together, um, the city of Chicago is not going to be monitoring or maintaining homeless shelters or dealing with the administrative needs of this program. He's making this a not-for-profit run enterprise. So many of these service providers are now delegate agencies of the city will now be the ones in charge entirely of the program. And there's a problem with that because of the fact that many of our delegate partners are not those not-for-profit agencies and whatnot that deal with homelessness, and indeed many of our other not-for-profits automatically take 15% of whatever funding we're spending on that particular issue and put it towards their own administrative personnel and salary that has nothing to do with the mission at hand. So, for example, if Organization X is a homeless provider and they have $1 million contract with the city to provide socks to the homeless, only 850,000 of that will actually go towards homelessness because 150,000 of it, 15%, will go towards paying for salaries, administration, and other issues within the organization itself before we even get to the actual expenditures related to the cause at hand. So in a way, when you ask who stands to benefit, many of those not-for-profit partners and individuals who claim to be doing good in the community are going to benefit financially from this new endeavor.
There are some people that think that maybe some elected officials might want to use these migrants for political work. Is that possible, like to gather petition signatures and whatnot?
Well, it wouldn't be legal for one, and if anyone found out that they were doing that, that candidate or elected official would risk being thrown off the ballot. But definitely, we know that there is a particular mindset when it comes towards individuals, particularly trying to ensure that the migrant asylum seekers stay here at all costs, and that's because there's a belief that there was going to be more funding coming to the city of Chicago under a potential Harris administration, um, which is what I think many Democratic people were hoping for. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
Uh, you said that they were trying to get more migrants in so that they would get the extra funding if
If
Kamala,
Kamala
yes.
under a potential Kamala Harris administration, yes.
Mm. But since that's not going to happen, then what are the ramifications for the city and for these homeless people, for the migrants and for the indigenous homeless?
Well, that is really the crux of where we find ourselves and why I think they're trying to pivot and calling them homeless as opposed to calling them migrants. We already get money from housing and urban development to address homelessness. We got $15 million last year specifically to address homelessness in the city of Chicago. 2 years ago, we got $65 million to address homelessness in the city of Chicago. And if you call the migrants homeless now you're able to tap into those dollars to pay for those individuals as the migrant support money evaporates.
So you mentioned that 15% that would go to administrative costs for nonprofits. If the city were to uh, uh, retain the administration of the homeless, would are they trying to kind of privatize it into nonprofits so that they could save money from hiring staff to oversee the homeless, or do you have any idea of what the behind the scenes? How would the city be spending more hiring people to oversee the homeless rather than parceling it out to the nonprofits and losing that 15%?
Some would argue that it is more beneficial and it allows for greater flexibility to parcel it out than have city employees do it. But I think you are exactly correct. You are in essence privatizing this service, but you're also privatizing it with organizations that oftentimes have political connections to those elected officials that are most engaged in this or are connected to the administration. Um, if you were to look at organizations, for example, on the Southwest side that receive money for many things, think of like there are a number of not-for-profits, and I won't get into naming them, but there are a number of not-for-profits on my side of town and all points in between where they get money as delegate agencies to perform certain tasks, whether it's from the city of Chicago or Board of Education. And then at the same time, they use that money and as a political organizing tool in which they are able to then recruit and build up an infrastructure for political purposes. And I think that's really the essence of where people are going right now with many of these organizations and the danger of relying solely on these organizations because they are not simply doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing this with motivations. And I think that if you really wanted to root all of that out, then there should be new requirements, which I've actually am working on now to state that if you are in receipt of city dollars as a delegate partner or agency, that you are explicitly prohibited from engaging in political activity, you or your employees. We have something similar like with the Board of Elections in the city of Chicago, where, as a board employee, they are not allowed to donate or participate in the election process because it's clearly something that you have an interest in. And I think the same should apply towards some of these not-for-profit partners to take the politics or the perception of politics out of what they do.
But they could still find some way to go around it, probably.
Well, I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way. But I will say that in making that kind of declaration, it basically would be telling everyone, we know what you're doing. We're on to what you're doing, and we want to put a stop to that. If you are here to help the homeless, then focus on helping the homeless. If you're here to help build opportunities in communities or to interrupt violence, then that should be your focus. It should not be, you should not be engaged in political activities simply because you're getting paid by the city of Chicago.
And when these organizations get money from Chicago, so they have to pay up front first and then get reimbursed by the city. So they have to do a lot of fundraising, right?
Oftentimes, yes.
And
Most of the time, our delegate partners have a reimbursement schedule, but not always. So it really depends on what the proposal is. For example, Play Streets in the city of Chicago, which deals with providing safe spaces for children in neighborhoods, that is based on a reimbursement schedule. But there are other programs that I know we offer that we pay up front for as well.
so when they get reimbursed like that, and they have to do fundraising, does sometimes that fundraising bleed into a political fundraising, and uh, how are they able to separate the two?
Well, that is one of the reasons why there's such a need for us to differentiate between the two.
Mhm.
And it's also one of the reasons why they've always tried to make the argument that it's not technically the city of Chicago's money if they're supporting political operations, if they haven't been reimbursed yet. But my feeling is that if you are working for the city of Chicago's program, you are still covered by what is prohibited activity with regards to political activities. It doesn't matter if you've been paid yet, you're still operating on our behalf. You are still an agent of the city of Chicago. And I think that is where we need to identify some clarification, because I do believe that many people look at these organizations as though they are just extensions of various local political machines. And oftentimes they are. We've seen that particularly in some of the more progressive wards in the city of Chicago, where some of your louder, stronger advocate agencies also, incidentally, are involved politically in either electing aldermen or doing some of the other issues that go on in politics. So I think we need to make sure that our residents, our taxpayers, have faith in a system where they don't feel that the machine is just morphed from one of patronage in City Hall to patronage on the streets.
Right, right. And then what could be done about it? It's right now, since there's no regulation, they're able to do that, and is that illegal if they do that now? Is there any investigation, or is it just perfectly legal? Unless some legislation starts reining it in.
Well, it's not illegal, but it is clearly questionable, and if not outright unethical.
Mhm.
But as such, since they are private organizations, they are not breaking any laws, um, specifically because there are no laws to break. That is why I think it's important that in pursuing what I have mentioned, which is to make it illegal for delegate agencies and partners and their employees to engage in political activities, is so important, because you have to have a benchmark to say what is acceptable and what is not. And if they choose to go beyond that threshold, then that gives us grounds to move forward. And all of this has to be with the mindset of, we're not trying to stop people from being delegate partners. We're not trying to stop our agencies. We just want to make sure that we are building trust and faith in what they're doing and in the use of the city's funding that we're giving them.
Well, that sounds right, because if they're going to be spending that money and helping helping these various constituencies, then they should be helping the
Yep.
constituencies rather than somebody else. But how is that legislation coming along? Do you have support? And does it need to extend even further beyond the city, like to the state?
Well, I think the state looked at something similar several years ago. I don't necessarily know if it was brought to a vote or not.
Mm.
Um, right now, it's in the formative stages, so there's nothing that's been introduced. But hopefully, whether in February or March, something similar will be introduced. I'll be introducing something and looking forward to conversations with my colleagues about it. Many of us have talked about the perception of organizations doing political work. The question is, how do you broach that with your God-given rights of political assembly and participation in process? So there's a fine line that has to be walked, but using, as I said, the Board of Elections as a starting point, as a reference point on how to do that, I think we should be in good shape to make that a reality.
And which committee would be overseeing this work?
I actually would love to see it go to the Committee on Ethics, because I think this is an ethical dilemma that we need to address with regards to the public perception of what we do.
Mhm. Do you have enough time for another question?
Go for it.
Okay.
You've
When
been waiting long enough. Go, all yours.
Thank you. When you were talking about the safety and you know those vehicles and the barriers, and so that we nothing happens in Chicago like what happened on Bourbon Street. Do we have enough uh, uh, barriers and manpower to protect these festivals? There are so many festivals in the city. Would we have to uh, separate, like which ones get protected, the bigger ones, and how do we even go about this if you know if we do it?
So currently, the city of Chicago only provides the barricades and things itself to some of the major events. And those major events like Lollapalooza and other events, they actually are required to reimburse the city of Chicago for the expense associated with providing that additional security. What I am recommending is that when a local a local festival, fair, or farmers market applies for a permit, that the city of Chicago require a simple change from a Type 3 barricade to a mobile vehicle barrier, which is the ones that are like that tip over if a car tries to drive and stop the car dead in its tracks. Right now, those expenses are incurred by the promoter of the event, the organizers of the event. They are not borne by the taxpayers at all. They are required to rent the appropriate barricade as required by the permit. And as I said, the only barrier recommended is a plastic Type 3 barricade, which is what we saw the individual drive around and do the carnage that he did. So there would be no need for additional cost of taxpayers, no additional training. It would just be a matter of renting the appropriate equipment. And I'm sure that there are entrepreneurs out there who'd be willing to buy them and rent them, just as there have been many individuals who've privately gone into the event management business.
So that cost would be just like a little additional cost for the promoter to pay for the additional barriers, like these better ones instead of those the plastic ones.
Correct. Yeah,
And
we are not in the business of renting barricades for
mm,
private events. And to be perfectly honest, some people have said, well, why don't we just use garbage trucks or other things? You know, there are only so many events that we could use to tie up both equipment and manpower. We have thousands of events throughout the city of Chicago that happen every year, particularly when you factor in farmers markets like the Logan Square Farmers Market, which has only the weakest of barricades. And we have seen where individuals can do a lot of damage if they choose to. I just think back to Germany during the Christmas market. You know, that individual injured 200 people driving unchecked through that market. That we easily see farmers markets with 500, 600 people on a weekend in some neighborhoods. They should be safe, and we could do it very simply by making this change now.
For, now that you mention it, in Rogers Park, we have the Glenwood Sunday Market. It's not a big market, but they only have like a couple of painted, decorated garbage receptacles, like the barrels
Yep.
to block the like Morse Avenue from Glenwood. So that's nothing.
Mhm. Right. So for that, that is a perfect example of if you had enough vehicle barriers, you wouldn't necessarily need anything beyond that because no one would be able to drive through that. And you just put them at both ends so that everyone in between is safe. And that should be a cost that's factored into the production of that market. And that could be budgeted accordingly if we tell people in advance, now this is what we're going to expect them to do, as opposed to down the road just surprising them later on. Because right now the permit packet is about to go live. So now is the perfect time to address some of those security concerns that we're raising.
Are there any other security concerns that you would like to mention now that you're working on?
Well, I think the the one that's grabbing most of my attention at the moment is preparation for Donald Trump's inauguration on the 20th. There's been a lot of discussion about immigration and undocumented and many of the Trump's policies that he's talked about, as well as the impact of our unchecked our unilateral welcoming city ordinance, which we've tried, as your listeners may know, to amend before. I believe that yes, the undocumented who choose to abide by the laws are in danger if we do not amend the welcoming city ordinance to allow our police officers to work with federal agents when we arrest somebody who is either undocumented or has some sort of temporary protective status, if they are involved in crimes involving gangs, drugs, prostitution, or human trafficking, or sex crimes against minors. I believe that if we were to amend that law and turn those individuals arrested of those four specific categories of crimes to our federal partners, then if we don't, it's going to put everyone else at risk. Because what's going to happen is that the new border czar, Tom Homan, is going to find out that we arrested someone who was involved in human trafficking and we let them go because we didn't want to call the feds. Well, they're going to go looking for that person anyway. And if they knock on the door looking for that person and find someone else who just happens to be in the same building and is undocumented but does everything right, they're going to take that person. They're not going to discriminate law-abiding undocumented or criminal and dangerous undocumented. They're just going to take whoever they find. And I don't want that. And I don't think any of us want that. I think many of us believe rightly that we should be welcoming. I believe we should be welcoming. But we should be welcoming to people who want to be positive contributors to our society. And if there are those who choose to engage in those four specific categories of crime once they get here, then we should not be providing them sanctuary. They should not be welcome. And if turning them over keeps everyone else safe while we wait to see what happens next, then I think that's the right path for us to go down. And that is why that is something that I will be working on and trying to bring to a vote at the January 15th meeting of the City Council. Because I think that if we can amend the law before Trump takes office, putting in those four carve-outs for when we will work specifically and solely with the federal government, that will take the bullseye off the backs of all of those undocumented law-abiding residents of Chicago who are afraid of being swept up just because they're looking for the bad guys and we're not willing to help them.
There's not much time. Is it feasible? Is it possible that this could be done?
So the ordinance was introduced in 2023, September 2023, to make those changes. Some of my more left progressive socialist colleagues have tried to stop us from making those changes, choosing to protect criminals as well as everyone else. But I believe that if we were to pass this ordinance on the 15th, that that would send a message to Tom Homan, whom I've met with, as well as to Donald Trump, that we are willing to work with them to remove these bad actors from our communities. I believe that Tom Homan and Donald Trump have a messaging problem, to be perfectly honest with you, because they constantly talk about mass deportations and things of that nature. But to be perfectly honest, that is completely unrealistic. We have 2 million active deportation orders now in the United States. That alone will keep them busy. But they're also going to want to focus on some of those high profile individuals who are committing very heinous acts in our communities. And right now, if the city of Chicago's policy is to catch and release and tell them, good luck, go find them, the good luck, go find them is going to catch all the wrong people. And that's what we need to protect people from. And I think that will send the right message to Tom Homan and to Donald Trump that, when it comes to those choosing criminality, that we are not going to support them. And I think a majority of Chicagoans support that stance as well.
Right now, if the police find them, they release them. They don't hold them at all if they know that those individuals have committed these heinous crimes.
So if someone is arrested for gang and drug activity who happens to be undocumented or has some sort of temporary protective status, um, they are just they are held until they have the bond court or what have you, and where a pretrial detention sentencing hearing happens. Now, in that time frame, what you could do is just call the federal authorities to come pick them up. And that's all that they want the opportunity to do, which is don't allow them to go before a pretrial detention hearing and be released, courtesy of the Safety Act, when if they are here committing such acts, they should be deported instead.
So those pretrial hearings, I thought that they took into consideration the severity of their crimes, and if they're too severe, they are not released. So the Safety Act allows the dangerous ones to be released.
The Safety Act has 4 different parameters in a hearing for the judge to make the determination on whether or not the crime was considered heinous, as well as if they are a risk of doing it again or fleeing. So you would be requiring and hoping that the judge would hold those individuals. And as we've seen, it's a crapshoot at the county court system as to whether or not a judge is going to abide by that or waiver.
And we have interviewed judges before, and they say that they've had a lot of training concerning the Safety Act about how to apply it to people that appear before the bench. Have you seen a lot of, do you know of a lot of these individuals who have done the heinous crimes that they have been accused of doing these heinous crimes? Have they been released and back onto the street? Do you have like a maybe approximate number? Has it happened a lot?
I don't have information on. But what I do know is why risk it? If I have an individual who we've caught selling drugs, involved in gang life, prostituting men and women, or human trafficking people, or committing crimes against children, sex crimes against children, who are not citizens, why wait?
And let's ask the question in another way. Do you know if there are individuals such as these who are being detained?
That are
Yeah,
undocumented or have protective status?
yeah, undocumented. That these individuals that you are talking about that would be turned over to the feds. But since that
Well,
Yeah.
I will say that our most reliable information is probably goes back to 2019,
Mhm.
because after the changes that were made by Lori Lightfoot, removing all um, carve outs, there's really no tracking mechanism to determine whether or not someone is undocumented or not. Because now our police officers do not ask that question. Now we know anecdotally that we have individuals who are gang members. We know anecdotally that we have individuals selling drugs, anecdotally engaging in prostitution and human trafficking, that are either undocumented and or covered by some sort of temporary protective status. But that is only based on a police officer's knowledge of the person. But it's not something that is quantifiable because when Lori Lightfoot made the last amendment to the Welcoming City Ordinance, we're no longer to keep that kind of information on hand.
Mhm. And she
And I
already.
want to and I need to stress too, overwhelmingly, overwhelmingly, undocumented and those with some sort of protective status are good, law-abiding residents of the city of Chicago. We are talking about a very, very, very small number of individuals who would be impacted by these changes. And these changes are not for jaywalking, they're not for minor incidental. I mean, you've got to be doing some pretty serious stuff to be qualified for these exemptions.
Mhm. Right. And then what about the human trafficking ordinance that or the well, you have done some work concerning addressing human trafficking from Africa, right?
Oh, yes. Well, yes. I
And
introduced an ordinance calling for an end to the human trafficking and slave trade in Africa. Yes.
mhm.
And
And
sadly, that has not gotten a hearing from our Committee on Human Relations. But I fully believe that it will be passed this year.
mhm,
We have seen where modern slavery has gripped Sudan, Nigeria, Mauritania, and many other African nations. And as we talk about genocide, as we talk about persecution, we cannot turn a blind eye to what's going on the continent of Africa right now, where hundreds of thousands of individuals are being persecuted, maimed, or killed by religious fanaticism, um, while the Western world is silent as to what's going on. And I first mentioned this when the Gaza ceasefire resolution was being debated at City Council, and I made mention of 5,000 Nigerian Catholics killed, martyred for their faith that nobody was referring to, nobody was calling into question or even talking about. And since then, we've been able to morph the conversation to be more inclusive of all faiths, all people, because it's really something that impacts not just Catholics and Christians, but Jews and Muslims as well. Not to mention other local tribes and religions. So I look forward to its passage. It's unfortunate that a very small number of my colleagues choose to ignore that travesty in Africa. But 42 out of 50 members said that we should be in support of this. So I hope that it gets the hearing and passage.
mhm. And do you have any insight about why the mainstream press and the U.S. government totally, well, almost totally ignores the plight of these people in Africa?
That's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer, but oftentimes, nobody really cares about what's going on in Africa. Sadly, um, we have seen where this latest confrontation between Israel and the Hamas terrorists following the October 7th attack brought worldwide attention to a 7-decade conflict that's had its ups and downs. Um, but yet the murder, genocide, and civil wars that have been going on in Africa go largely unnoticed. They're like asterisks in history. And it's really sad and unfortunate because so much can be done to help elevate what's going on there and raise awareness to help bring some peace and stability to the continent. But oftentimes it's overlooked and overshadowed by other things.
And over there, the cost of living is so low. Even a little bit helps, but that little bit is not going there.
No, and I think that's going to be the next, I'm sure at some point Africa will be the next great continent of warfare as we see the Western world and some of our communist adversaries and agitators like North Korea, China, Russia, looking for mineral resources. We know Africa is overflowing with capabilities, and which in any other circumstance would have been enough to lift up entire populations, but because of some of the regimes there, it's very autocratic. But I think that at some point you're going to see the Western world with its diminishing resources trying to muscle its way there against some of the other allies, some of the other adversaries, excuse me, who are already making inroads in Africa as we speak.
Seems as if,
Because
yeah, it kind of sounds like another kind of colonization instead with a different term.
economic colonization, I guess, is what you would call it.
Mhm. Well, Alderman Raymond Lopez, thank you so much for all your insight, information, and all the work that you do.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for
Yeah,
having me and look forward to coming back sometime soon.
of course. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
You can follow me on X at Raymond A. Lopez. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram. I'm there, and I'm happy to be a wealth of information for you and your listeners. And oftentimes, if you are including me, I'm the one that's actually responding on X too. So you don't have to worry. It's not a staff member.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alderman Lopez.
All right, take care.
You too.